about the lame and about liars and about the Lord. The lame, the liars, and the Lord. This pool of water was most likely just north of the temple area. If you think of sort of a pond or sort of a large pool, it would have been about that size. It would have been surrounded on 4 sides by what we would call sort of a concrete type structure where these lame and invalid and paralyzed and blind could just sort of lay and sit there waiting for the waters to stir. And it was divided in the middle by another structure, another piece of stone or concrete or barrier. On the one side was for the women, and on the other side was for the men. So you get the 5 colonnades by the 4 sides, and then what's divided in the middle. The pool of water was most likely called Sheep, probably for 2 reasons. One, it was most likely reddish in color because of the minerals that were in the water, and also because the pool probably laid along the road or the side where they would bring the sheep past it to go to the temple to prepare for the slaughter. So most likely that's why the pool of water was called the Sheep. And it's understandable that why the blind would have been there and the lame and the paralyzed would have been there. This is sort of the hospital, if you would. The water was considered to have some sort of medicinal or healing power to it. And so these folks were there on a regular basis. You notice that Jesus goes to the hospital. He doesn't wait for the hospital to come to him. He goes to where they are to see them and to talk to them and to, in this case, bring about a healing. And so the first one is about the lame. This man who was lame, he had been in this physical condition longer at that time than most people would have been alive. He was an invalid for 38 years, which obviously meant he would have been at least 38 years old. He would have been older than Jesus. Most people that day probably would not have lived to have been quite that age. So he was an invalid longer than most people were alive. Notice the details of verse 6. Notice the details of verse 6. The recognition of the fact that the man had been wandering to the water's edge for a long time. And you'll see the sensitivity of Jesus in asking the man or seeking to engage the man's will. He says to him, "Do you want? Do you want? Is it your wish? Is it your desire? Is it your will to be made whole, to be healed? Do you want this?" In order to sort of liven the invalid's sense of hope, he asked that question. Now here's a very insightful, valuable peek into human nature with the question that Jesus asked. Do not think that people with needs, no matter how acute or severe, automatically want your help. Do not make the assumption that people with severe or acute needs automatically want or desire your help. Because that is not always the case. That is not always the case. A sense of need is never solely sufficient as the sole impetus in seeking help. Sometimes need coupled with frustration will lead to futility, which will sometimes cause the person just to sort of abandon. Some people will use the need as an excuse to avoid responsibility, and it's their way of gathering attention to themselves. They don't really want your help. Now please don't take that as a general statement that anybody who has need, that's the category they fall in. Obviously, you and I have to be very discerning when it comes to this. Let me give you an example. I have a good friend of mine that I've known since, Lord have mercy, over 30 years. When I talk to him today, if I were to talk to him today, he would bring up the same issues that he brought up last year, that he brought up the year before, that he brought up the year before, that he brought up the year before. Nothing has changed. I have nothing new to say to him. The problems are the same. My solutions, my counsel is the same. Nothing has changed. It would be like he clicks play, and I click play. It's the same thing. And there comes a point in time where that kind of person will literally suck the energy and the life from you. Because they will always lay it upon you, sort of this idea of guilt and shame of where they are in life, and you have done everything you could to help them, and they just refuse to budge. And that you have a tough decision to make. Because you will find yourself preoccupied with one person to the detriment of all other relationships. Now, I'm not saying that's the norm at all. I'm saying that's not unusual. And so in my case, I basically talk to this gentleman who's probably 2 years younger than me infrequently. And when he does call and wants to go out to dinner, I no longer accept. I'm not interested in reminiscing about the old days, nor am I interested in rehashing old news when he's not willing to listen to the counsel from the Word of God, which will bring healing. It's the start of healing to him. Do I pray for him? Yes. Does my heart ache for him? Yes, it does. So Jesus, knowing human nature, asks the question, is it your will, your desire, do you really want to be healed? Or are you here gathering attention for yourself? Here's another sometimes sad observation of human nature from the response you see in verse 7, where the sick man answers him and said, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me." Obviously, this pool of water would have had some sort of spring, so you would have saw this occasional bubbling of water. Sort of folklore may have been that an angel may have dipped their wings into the pool, and at that instant when it happened, if you stepped in when that happened, you would have received healing. Some folks just believe that the water, sort of hot springs, had a natural healing effect to them. But you'll notice that if somebody was healed out of this water, no one turned back around to help anyone else. The man didn't have any friends to actually carry him into the water, probably because he was too much of a burden. And certainly if anyone received any healing, they never stopped to turn around and to help. With any healing, the natural response from healing should be gratitude. And the natural reaction out of gratitude should be help. That's the way it should work. If by the grace of God He has touched your life and brought healing to you or help to you, your response, my response should be, thank you. Now, how can I reciprocate this into the life of someone else? You don't see any of that here. Despite the disappointment, the man is determined, did not despair in defeat. This pool of water may have had some limited potency to it, but Jesus, as the living water, had unlimited power. Unlimited power. When you read through the Gospel of John, look at how many times Jesus used the analogy of water. It's beautiful. It's just beautiful. If you're living in an arid, dry, sort of desert area, and water is even more precious to you and I because all we need to do is, generally turn on a spigot, fill a baptismal pool, fill a bottle of water, fill a glass. We don't even think about it. For these folks, this is life and death, water. Jesus is the living water. He says, read the Scriptures, because out of the Scriptures you will find me, and out of that will flow rivers of water. The living water, water that overflows, living springs of water flowing out of your heart that bubbles up and flows into the lives of other people. What does Jesus do to bring the healing here? In verse 8. What does He do? Jesus said to him. Is this like the story of Pete and repeat? Jesus speaks. Could have touched them. Could have physically did something. Could have grabbed some mud. Could have, some bulrushes. Something. Touch.